Happy New Year to all our members and your friends who have joined us tonight for the webinar. To continue the positive spirit of the holiday season, we are delighted to have our guest speaker today, Janice Munemitsu, share her very special, inspirational, and poignant story. By way of introduction, Janice has over 20 years of experience in the corporate world of consumer brands, including the Clorox Company, Mars, and ConAgra, where she last served as VP of Brand Marketing. She received her BA and MBA from University of Southern California, and I hear she is a very avid, dedicated Trojan fan, to the point that she never misses a home game, and she's even at many away games. Since her corporate career, she has evolved into a second career after receiving her Master's of Arts in Spiritual Formation and Soul Care from Biola University. She is in private practice now and on the staff at Biola's on-campus Center for Spiritual Renewal. I also believe Janice has developed a third career, as she recently has authored a book titled The Kindness of Color. And she's here to share the cross-cultural interaction of two immigrant families, the Munemitsus and the Mendez families, and their supporters along their life journey, and most importantly, their historic impact on school desegregation. Please welcome Janice Munemitsu.
Thank you, Janice, and thank you to all of your members. I'm so honored to speak to you tonight about this story. So let me just go ahead and start. This picture is myself with Sylvia Mendez, and Sylvia was just 8 years old when this story impacted her life. I want to just give you the reason this is called The Kindness of Color is the book I've written about. Sylvia and I have told verbal stories about this for quite a few years. Sylvia more than I have probably for the last 30 years, but this is the first time we've documented it. And the reason I call it The Kindness of Color is, as Sylvia and I have talked about it verbally, there's so many pivots where there was a kind gesture or support from people in the midst of a lot of different adversity that our families faced. And that is what brought the hope and inspiration to go forward and move on. So let's go ahead and get started, and I'll introduce the main characters in the next slide, please. This is Gonzalo and Felicitas Mendez, Sylvia's parents. Both of them came to the United States as young children. Felicitas and her family were from Puerto Rico, and so they initially stopped in Arizona to work, but then decided to come to California, mostly because of the climate and the work opportunities. Her parents were working as farm laborers. Gonzalo similarly came here to work. His family came to Southern California from Mexico, and he came as a young man as well. In fact, he also attended school in Orange County as a young boy. And as he continued to work in the farms, he got to meet his future bride. One of his co-workers on the farm was Felicitas' father. And I think Felicitas' father saw a really hardworking young man and invited Gonzalo to dinner, and that's how they met. They married, and after a few years of working on farms, they decided that they wanted to try to open a restaurant, and they did that. And it became the Arizona Cantina in Santa Ana, California. And they were, even by the time they were 30, they were quite successful entrepreneurs, serving meals and serving the community in Santa Ana. My grandparents, Seima and Masako Munemitsu, are on the right, and this is a picture actually from 1921. My grandfather actually came to the United States first with his parents in 1916, But after about 5 years, he was 17 years old. After 5 years, he went back to Japan, married my grandmother Masako. They're from the same hometown. And when they got married, this is their wedding picture, essentially from 1921. My grandfather is from Kochi, Kochiken, which is on Shikoku Island. It's the smallest of the major 4 islands of Japan. And it's even today still very much agricultural. And my grandmother is from there as well. In this picture, I just want to point out something, and this is kind of one of the themes to our story, is this whole idea of cultural blending. My grandfather has on a Western suit, and my grandmother has on a traditional Japanese kimono, and you're going to see that theme as we move through the story. Next slide, please. By 1930, my grandfather had the chance to lease a farm in Westminster, California. Now, while he would have loved to have bought some land himself, the alien land laws prevented him from doing that because he was an immigrant and not a born citizen. And I'll just show you, I want to point out this barn and this house because these 2 structures that no longer stand, but these 2 structures would come to be very important in the Mendez story as well. My grandfather leased this land from an elderly woman and became quite good friends with that family because it still was pretty rare that a white family might trust their farm to a Japanese or an immigrant family. And so that's one of the kindnesses that we have in this story. Next. My father is the oldest son. His name is Seiko Lincoln Munemitsu, but throughout his life, he was known as Tad. I think most people think his legal name was Tad, but it was actually Seiko Lincoln Munemitsu. And we actually are coming up close to his what would have been his 101st birthday in February. You've got to sort of imagine immigrant parents wanting to come to America, and their first son is born the day after Lincoln's birthday on February 13th. And so my dad has the honor. He's the only one in their family who has a middle name after a US president. But I think it just goes to show how much my grandparents really wanted to embrace the American lifestyle. This picture is my dad as the oldest, his brother, my uncle. My grandmother's in the back with a family friend with her young son. But I want you to notice there's 4 kind of brownish structures in the background. I think you could probably only see 3 based on the way the picture is, but there are these 4 cottages. And on the farms in those days, the workers actually lived on the farm. And so these cottages were what we would call the workers' cottages, and the workers would work and live on the farm because there were no, there wasn't a lot, this is pretty agricultural land in Westminster. There weren't apartments or small housing developments. So those cottages would also become a major part of our story. The senior picture is my dad, Huntington Beach High School graduate, local graduate. But my dad has a couple unique things about his life. Not only was he named after President Abraham Lincoln, and he always said he was always so thankful that his parents didn't choose Valentine as a middle name because he was born the day before Valentine's Day and the day after Abraham Lincoln's birthday. So it was a possibility, but he was always grateful that they chose an American president over Valentine for his middle name. He also was struck by polio, as many in those years were. This would have been in the 1930s. And so he survived polio. Many children did not, as you all know, but he survived, but he also unfortunately had a disability. One of his legs and foot was very, was disabled. And so he basically had a club foot for the rest of his life. And he, but no matter what, he played sports in high school as best he could. And he also, as a farmer, was on his feet his entire life. He was also a young landowner, which really makes our story quite unique. As I mentioned, my grandfather leased that land from an elderly woman. And when she died, she actually in her will said that she wanted to give the first right of ownership to my grandfather. If he wanted and could buy the land, then she wanted him to have the first right to do that. Now, she likely knew that as an immigrant, especially an Asian Japanese immigrant, the Asian land laws restricted that, and he was not able to be a landowner. But his firstborn, American-born US citizen son, my dad, Tad, would be able to. So as a young child, my dad actually had his name on this land. They found a way. They went to their banker, Mr. Frank Monroe, who had been really a great friend and very supportive of our family. And Frank Monroe used to kind of mentor, honestly, my dad in banking and business, even as young as 8 years old, because my dad would go to translate English to Japanese and Japanese to English for his father when they went to do business at the bank. And so Mr. Frank Monroe helped them brainstorm this. And the solution was to find a guardian who was a Japanese American born citizen to stand in as my dad's guardian. So my dad, even though he had both parents, he also had what I would call a business guardian to help him to have rightful ownership of this land. And so that was one of the major kindnesses in the book, a major pivot in our story. Next, please. Kindness is taking time to help others, no matter how young they are. And I have these kindness statements throughout my book to denote these major pivots where somebody, whether it be an action like Mr. Monroe or just even supportive friendship, was really key in how our families survived different challenges and adversities throughout this story. But this one is specifically to honor Mr. Frank Monroe, because you got to imagine he's a banker and he's got this little 8-year-old boy in his bank who is trying to help translate from one language to another. And that friendship with my father would last the rest of his life. Next, please. So this was a good picture of life before World War II. The formal picture, it's my father, my uncle, my grandparents, and my 2 aunts. My aunts are a twin. And also the older lady on the left side, she is my grandfather's stepmother who lived with her family, our family, as a widow. On the right side, I want to just point out, here's another example of cultural blending. My grandmother is now in a Western style dress, but my 2 aunts are in colorful Japanese girl kimonos holding their blonde baby dolls. And just knowing my aunts, they proudly wanted those dolls to be in the picture with them. So it was a real contrast. Now, at this time, my aunts, none of the family other than my grandparents had been to Japan. The English was the primary language spoken by my dad and his siblings. But the girls, somebody must have sent those kimonos to them. And so they proudly donned those, but with their blonde baby dolls. Next, please. So that was farm life in Westminster before December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was bombed by Japan. And my father remembers that day. It was a Sunday, and he was in the field harvesting cabbage with his workers. And the farm is right along a road called Edward Street. And down Edward Street, that morning, some men were driving by, and they stopped and just yelled horrible racial slurs at my father. And while he had been a victim of bullying and things like that before because of our race, this seemed different to him. This seemed much more vicious and much more, just much more harmful, much more threatening. So when they went in for lunch that day, he and the other workers, one of the workers turned on the radio, and that is when he heard that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. And that gave him more reason to understand why the racial slurs and the harassment had happened that morning. Even that week of December 7th, many Japanese, depending on where you lived, if you lived near a military base, if you lived near the harbor, or any strategic area along the coast, they were removed from their homes and businesses the same week in December of 1941. For our family, more details to what was going to happen to them started to happen on February 19th, when Executive Order 9066 was signed by President Franklin Roosevelt, which essentially said that any person of Japanese ancestry in Washington, Oregon, or California would be removed without exception, and didn't exactly say where they were going to go, but that they would be removed from their homes and their businesses, their farms, their livelihoods. And plans were then underway to make that happen. For our family, let's go to the next slide, please. The middle of May, so a couple of months later, they started to prepare because they didn't know what was going to happen, but they started to prepare to think about what are the options for them. But on May 14th, it became very clear that my grandfather was arrested by the FBI, accused of spy activity, as were these men and many others. Now, these men, if you see in the picture, most of them are older. My grandfather might be one of the younger men. He was in his early 40s at the time. He had also been in the United States for 26 years of his life. And so these are not new residents or new immigrants. These are people who had come to America and for the most part had been there for several decades working and building their lives. But because in different ways, these men were community leaders, mostly in service organizations or social Japanese clubs or Japanese language schools for their children, that was enough evidence for the FBI to start rounding them up. This particular picture is at the Department of Justice labor camp in Lordsburg, New Mexico, where they spent time. My grandfather was gone from the family for about 2.5 years. And most of these men were taken from their families for at least 2 years in these Department of Justice camps. Next slide, please. For the rest of the family, it was just 3 days later that they had to leave the Westminster farm for Poston, Arizona. And Poston, Arizona is right on the other side of the Colorado River, California-Arizona border. It actually happens to be on the Colorado River Indian tribe land. So another interesting part of this is the tribal lands that they put the camps on, at least this camp. Now you'll notice it's my dad, my uncle, the 2 sisters, my aunts, and my grandmother. And Sema is now in New Mexico. They are in Poston. And I call this a brave photo for Sema, because my aunt, one of my aunts said that she remembers that this was the photo that they sent to their father. So you could see that they're trying to kind of smile, my one aunt more than the other, and my grandmother kind of just trying to say, you know, we're together, we're okay. But really they weren't. These were tar paper barracks. They were out in the middle of the desert. There is really nothing out here. That we're not talking Palm Desert or Scottsdale, Arizona. This is really pretty desolate area. And it was very, very hot in the summer, very, very cold and frigid in the winter. And they had uninsulated tar paper barracks and very public facilities in terms of bathroom facilities and shower facilities and communal cafeterias. So these camps were not what you think of as summer camp. I think a lot of people get confused when we say there were incarceration camps or internment camps. It sounds more like camping than it is a camp with barbed wire, with guards, and the guards are pointing the guns inward, not outward. Our family has another distinction of having 2 family numbers, 24-132 and 2344 A and B. When a family came into the camp, they were registered, they were given a number, they were given a part of a barrack space. There were 4 units per barrack. And it didn't matter how big your family was, you got one of those units. So here you had 5 people in a space of about 20 by 25 or so feet. And that was where their sleeping quarters were, and quote unquote, their living quarters. All the kitchen and bathroom facilities were communal. But that is where they would end up spending almost the next 3 years. But the reason we have two numbers here is my two aunts in May, that week in May, they had the chicken pox. And so they could not just go with the rest of the family into the camp on the train. They were sent to one of the local hospitals where they were cared for by the nurses of that hospital. And hence, here's another kindness that their mother, and if you think about it, my grandmother lost her husband 3 days before this, and now her young daughters are being taken from her, and she's going to go with her two sons to the camp. My aunts were in this hospital for about 2 weeks until my one aunt says, until the spots went away of chicken pox, and then they returned. A nurse escorted them on the train back to the camp. And I asked my aunt, I said, did you ever even think about, like, why did you come to the hospital in a car and then you're leaving and going home on a train? And she said, no, we were just too excited. They were only 7 years old. And they felt secure with the nurse. I think here's where it was such a blessing that they were a twin, because they had each other. And they just thought that when you had spots, your family couldn't come see you. So I think as a blessing to them, some of the trauma of that experience was lessened because they're a twin. But my aunt on the right, Aki, said the first time she realized something was wrong was she was on the train and she could see her mother as the train pulled to the station. And her mother, my grandmother, was just crying in tears. And she didn't see her father. And she thought, now something is wrong. And that was her first indication of what was going to happen over the next 3 years. Next slide, please. In total, 120,000 Japanese in Washington, Oregon, and California lost their freedom. And importantly, about 2/3 of these were American-born citizens. They were like my father, my uncle, my aunts. They were the children of the first generation Issei immigrants. But they lost their freedom. They had to give up their homes, their businesses, their schools. There were some older Japanese students who were enrolled in medical school or universities in the West Coast, and they had to leave their programs, and they were sent to one of these 10 camps. A lot of times I put the numbers because it's one thing to say 120,000, but when you think about almost 18,000 people in the middle of the desert at by the Colorado River in Poston, this made Poston, Arizona, the third largest city in all of Arizona at the time. It was Phoenix is number one, Tucson is number two, and Poston, this incarceration camp, was number three with almost 18,000 people. So putting it in perspective, this was a huge forced removal of innocent citizens and legal residents. People are pretty surprised sometimes also that the camps were as far east as Arkansas. And then in the Midwest, we had Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Minidoka in Idaho. The two camps are Granada, Machi in Colorado, Utah, and two in Arizona and two in California. Often people say, we've never heard of these places. And it's like, yeah, maybe you've heard of Manzanar because it's on the way to Mammoth on 395. But you never heard of these places because they, even today, are very, very hard to get to. Next slide, please. Now, I mentioned that the Japanese had to figure out what was going to happen with their existing homes, whether they leased a home or an apartment or owned one, if they had a business. Many of them were small business people or farmers. And this is another place where Mr. Frank Monroe steps in to help our family. My dad at this point is 20 years old, and he knows he's going to be leaving Westminster. He has no choice. he goes to Frank and asks, what do you think we should do? And I think Mr. Monroe was very, very brave in saying, when the whole world is at war, he said, I think this will end. I think you can come back. And I think maybe he just hoped for the best, but he said, let's try to lease the farm. Let's lease it. And that meant the house, the barn, everything in it, all the farm equipment, even the crop in the ground. And the workers would stay in the cottages, and let's see if we could lease the whole thing. And so thanks to Frank Monroe, he also knew Mr. Gonzalo Mendez. Gonzalo, with his restaurant, was a customer of Mr. Monroe, and he went to him. He also knew that Gonzalo always wanted to be a farmer. Gonzalo had been a farm worker, but Gonzalo always wanted to be what his family now says is the boss of a farm. And so he went and talked to him and said, hey, maybe this is your chance to try farming. All you have to do is rent the whole thing. You don't even have to buy any implements. Everything is there. And that's what happened. So thanks to Frank Monroe, a dream for the Mendez family came to fruition, and our home, our family home on the farm, was secured. I think one of the main themes throughout our story and throughout my book, in many, many other ways than what I just shared with you, is kindness is trusted friendships, building trusted friendships. And this is such an important part of our story. We see this throughout our story in so many different ways, but one of this one, the leases here, are a key to what's going to happen next. Let's go to the next slide, and I'll stop here to see if there's any questions that I can answer, or if there's any clarifications that you might have.
We don't have any questions in writing yet, so I think we should continue and take it at the end. How's that?
Sounds good.
Okay.
So now Mr. Mendez and his wife Felicitas have leased the farm, and they're going to move their family probably less than 10 miles from their home. They owned a home in Santa Ana. He leased it, and he was going to move everyone to the farmhouse that you saw on our Westminster farm. When he did that, he just assumed that his children would go to the same school that my father and uncle and aunts went to, Westminster 17th Street School. It was the closest one. Back then, there were only 3 high schools and even just very few elementary schools. So it seemed like the right assumption until in the fall of 1944, when they went to enroll at that school, Sylvia and her 2 brothers were denied admission because of their last name and the color of their skin, because they were Mexican. In Westminster School District, it was segregated, and there was a Mexican school, and this large class picture here is a picture of all the Mexican students at Hoover School, which was the Mexican school, and only the white school, the 17th Street School, were where the white students and a handful of Japanese families went. Now, it's interesting that the Japanese families could go to Westminster 17th Street School, as my family did, but Sylvia and her brothers could not. There's a lot of problems with Hoover School. The facilities were, to some degree, somewhat dangerous. It was near a cow pasture that had an electric fence, which was pretty harmful when you think of school children playing around and not watching where they're playing. It didn't have a playground, but most importantly, it did not have academic subjects. When Sylvia and her brothers went, they felt like they were being trained to be good maids and good servants and good farm laborers. There was no English, math, science, history like they were used to in their home, their previous home. And so this is where the very seed of this idea that separate is not equal comes from. And as we'll go to the next slide, and I'll tell you a little bit more of what happens next. So Mr. Mendez I give him a lot of credit. He went back to the school to talk to the principal. He went back to Westminster School District to talk to them. He went to the Orange County Department of Education at the time, and he could get no relief from this. His children spoke great English. They had already been in a school with academic subjects, but he could not get Westminster to change their mind on attending the Westminster 17th Street School versus the quote unquote Mexican school. Through another kindness, he meets a man named David Marcus. David Marcus is an attorney. He actually happens to be Jewish, but because he was married to the daughter of a prominent Mexico City physician, and they spoke Spanish in their home, and he worked for the Mexican consulate. He was actually known around town as the Mexican attorney, even though he was Jewish. So Mendez meets David Marcus, and Marcus has had some experience in some of these cases of inequity against the Mexican race. And he decides he's going to hire him, and he's going to pay for Marcus's time with the profits from the asparagus field. And so that's why this is called Mendez et al. Versus Westminster et al. The other thing Mr. Mendez does is he starts talking around Orange County to other Latino Mexican families, and finds 4 other families who are having similar issues for their children with school districts in segregated schools. So the Palominos, Ramirez, Estrada, and Guzman families joined the effort. And so it is Mendez et al., including these 4 other families, that now go from Orange County to a federal class action lawsuit. Mr. Marcus makes tons of decisions on this, trying to figure out how the best way to win the case. And I've got to tell you, none of these 5 Mexican families ever thought that they would be in federal court. They just wanted to raise the issue to get some relief, but it ended up that Mr. Marcus decided to file in U.S. District Court. He did not file in California State Court. California at that time already had a law that said it was okay to have segregated schools for Native Americans, Chinese, and Japanese people. So by school district, depending on where you lived, that school district could make the determination. And so he decided to go to federal court. And by going to federal court, he could prove that citizens, these young children, were unequally treated. And this violates the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment. Now, interestingly enough, that Equal Protection Clause is also what was violated for the government to send the Japanese US-born citizens, all of my dad and my uncle and aunts, to the internment camp. So there's some parallels in our story, even though one is about school segregation and the other is about the incarceration camps. This is one place where the stories connect. Next slide, please. Kindness is courage to stand for what is fair and just for all. And I think we just have to realize Orange County was very rural at that time. There was not a lot of industry. It was mostly farming and small business. And these 5 families decided that they were going to stand up for this. And I think this is something where they really felt like they were doing this not just for their family, but for the whole community. I don't think at the time they realized that it was for the whole state, and actually led to more equity on a national basis. But it was pretty courageous of these families. They ended up driving for 6 days to Los Angeles, to the U.S. District Court in LA, to do this trial with Paul McCormick, who was the judge. And Judge McCormick was known to be a very fair, very influential man in the community in Los Angeles. He and his family were very involved in the Catholic Church and in different service organizations in the community. And so Sylvia remembers driving all the way to LA. You have to remember there was no 5 freeway. They went every day dressed up in their best clothes, because not only were the parents listed as plaintiffs, every single child in those 5 families was listed as well. So they took that whole week and they went every day to court. Now, Judge McCormick was also very, very thorough. And while we would hope that we would see a judgment in the next day or two, that's not what happened. Next slide, please. I want to point out that the court case was happening in 1945. And by this time, our families had been without their freedom. They had been in the camps for almost 3 years, actually just over 3 years. And so also towards the end of 1944 and the beginning of 1945, through a lot of different means, there was a lot of indication that the war would be coming to an end. And in fact, in August, when the US bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and with total devastation of those places where hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives, but it did force Japan to end the war and to surrender. And so by September, my father and a lot of other Japanese knew that they would be leaving the camp, at least at Poston Camp. This date kind of changes depending on where they were, but for most people in Poston, it was that August-September timing. So knowing that, my father and Gonzalo had to talk about what's going to happen when our family can go back to the farm. And this got a little complicated because now Gonzalo is in the middle of a lawsuit called Mendez versus Westminster. Not a good idea to leave Westminster. He's got to stay there. His house is being leased out. And he has spent all the profits from the asparagus farm on this case. So he doesn't really have any funding to then start his next enterprise. I think by this time he had decided farming was not for him. And so that was Gonzalo's side of the case. My dad's side was, hey, we want to come back. We want to start to work again, build our lives back up. He had been working actually, and this gets more complicated, but they had been working, but of course, not on their own property and not building up their own farm. And so what they did, and this is my kindness statement, is collaborating together for a win-win solution. My dad and Gonzalo decided in the lease, it says that the Munamitsus will return to the farm. They will live in those one of the workers' cottages, and they will bring their friends who have no place to go to live in the other 3 cottages. And they will work for Gonzalo for daily wages, and Gonzalo can continue that lease for a year. So this is one of those, trading places kind of stories where the owner is now working for the guy who's leasing the property, and the guy who's leasing the property is now the boss of the owners of the farm. I think that this took place for over a year. And the 2 families lived on the farm together, as well as other Japanese families who did not have a place to go. My grandfather and my dad invited them to come. And I think Gonzalo probably had mostly a work crew of all professional farmers on his hand for that year. But it did allow for a win-win solution, and was pretty critical to this case in terms of allowing Gonzalo to continue to focus on that, still building for his own future after us as well. Next slide, please. Finally, Judge McCormick, if you remember, the case was in July of 45, but finally 7 months later, he rules in favor of the families. And I love that he was so thorough, but I know that they missed a whole nother fall semester of their schooling. But he says a paramount requisite in the American system of public education is social equality. It must be open to all children, regardless of lineage. And I think that's probably the key statement in his ruling. So Sylvia, Gonzalo, and Jerome, they get to now go to 17th Street School in Westminster, where all their friends that they play with on the farm are going, all their white friends are going, and they get to go. but the ruling was appealed by the three other school districts. Westminster conceded, but the three others did not. And so now, next slide, please. Now the case goes to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. So between December 46 and April 47, they try the case at the Court of Appeals. And on April 14th, they uphold Judge McCormick's ruling for the families. Meanwhile, sometimes I don't think our state moves that fast, but back then they moved pretty fast, because between January and June of 1947, the state assembly and Senate passed the Anderson bill. And the Anderson bill is the bill that desegregates California public schools, not giving the school districts the right to segregate the children anymore. So it becomes a statewide mandate that schools will be desegregated. Interestingly enough, Governor Earl Warren, he goes from this case in 1947, 7 years later, he's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he rules on Brown versus Education at a national level in 1954, 7 years later. So this is one of the ties that we have to the national Supreme Court ruling on Brown versus Board of Education. I mean, Earl Warren has seen this case. He's seen the predicament of different people, different races in California. But I do want to mention that Governor Earl Warren, when he was Attorney General or Lieutenant Attorney General of California, he actually was for the incarceration of the Japanese Americans during World War II. So I just point that out because these issues of race and prejudice are not so easily, it's very dependent on politics, I think, on circumstances, and people will go back and forth on what is okay and what is not okay. It's not always such an easy decision when we come to racism. And I'll just say real quickly, this picture is my dad's third grade picture from Westminster 17th Street School, where you can see there's probably about five or six different Japanese children amongst a mostly white classroom. And this is a far different picture than the Mexican school that you saw earlier with when I started talking about Sylvia and their predicament at the Hoover Mexican School. My dad is the guy with the overalls and the big grin in front of the brick wall. Next, please. So this is Sylvia most recently, well, not most recently, in 2011. In 2011, she was given a Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Obama. And in that same year, the Mendez versus Westminster stamp commemorating the case was issued. And this is Sylvia with her siblings, 3 of which were part of this case and 2 that were born after that. Next slide, please. I want to mention something interesting about the Poston camp. It was on the Colorado River Indian Reservation and with almost 18,000 people. And this map is probably from the 40s, but these little square dots right in the center, it looks like little checkerboards, that's where Poston 1, 2, and 3 camps were. And you can see they're right in the middle of the Indian Reservation. And if you look closely, it says area reserved for Mojave Indians, area to be colonized by Navajo, area to be colonized by the Hopi Indians. This is where our Japanese American heritage and history intersect with the history of the Colorado River Indian Reservation and tribe. They call themselves CRIT, Colorado River Indian Tribe, and we have kind of a unique collaboration with them. There's an alliance that hosts almost an annual reunion or pilgrimage of Japanese Americans to the Native American this area, this reservation. And what the Japanese left in terms of legacy here is irrigation, canals. They built roads. They brought electricity into the middle of the camp. For those 3 years, they built adobe schools. And so when Navajo and Hopi Indians came, every single leader, I was just there in October, and every single leader that was part of this pilgrimage, that is a leader of the Colorado River Indian tribe, every single one was interesting. They had all lived as children in one of the Japanese American barracks from World War II. So I could talk for hours on this collaboration, but it's very interesting where you find that the kindness that I see is that these Native Americans remember what others have suffered with compassion and hospitality, even when they have suffered far worse. Next slide, please. These are just a few recent pictures of what's still there. This long, tall monument was established in 1992, and that commemorates 50 years of the Japanese coming to the camp. The Parker train station pretty much looks like it did in 1942 when the Japanese arrived. And then the other pictures just show some commemorative bricks that different families have put. This is for my family, my father's side and my mother's side, to remember those who spent time behind barbed wire in the desert. Next, please. Kindness is sacrificing for the good of others. And throughout my book, I probably have about under 50, but maybe 40 to 45 kindnesses statements. And so I've just kind of given you a top line of the story, but in the midst of a lot of adversity and racism, the Japanese Americans, they're incarcerated, yet many of the young men and women served and fought in World War II. The Japanese 442nd and 100th Battalion are one of the most decorated Army units during World War II, yet their parents and families were behind barbed wire at home. Mexican American families were denied but fought for equal education. The Mendez et al. Families, all those 5 families. A white banker rose against racism to serve all of his customers. A Jewish attorney fights with the Catholic judge to uphold the Equal Protection Clause for all the citizens, even young students. And Black attorneys, Robert Carter and Thurgood Marshall, and I'm sure you've all heard their names, they were young attorneys at the NAACP at the time, and they wrote an amicus brief that gave support for Mendez versus Westminster, as well as, and I just talked about a little more about the Colorado River Indian tribe and the Japanese American Poston Alliance holding the Poston story. What happened on that land? Next, please. I don't know, many of you, some of you might be from Orange County, but many of, and if you're not, I'll just give you a kind of an interesting story. In May 1970, and actually for several years before that, when I was a young kid, I remember stuffing letters in envelopes because my dad was helping to raise money for this Japanese tea house and garden right at the Civic Center. That larger brick wall behind the Japanese pavilion is our courthouse in Santa Ana, California. But he and other Japanese Americans who returned after the war to their farms and to their businesses and homes raised $50,000, which is more like $500,000 in today's dollars, to put this here. And the dedication plaque says, dedicated and presented for the pleasure of the people in Orange County by the Japanese American community. A grateful arigato in honor of our pioneer fathers and for the blessings of freedom. And this was dedicated 25 years after they had returned back to Orange County. Now, it's pretty interesting because you could go look all over. There's several other plaques there, but none of them talk about World War II. None of them talk about the camps or the barracks. None of them talk about the loss of freedom, which I think is a very Asian way, kind of a repressed Asian way of dealing with it. But nonetheless, we were blessed because there were parts of the West Coast and California and other places that actually voted to not let the Japanese come back after World War II. And there was never any sign of, or any evidence of espionage or spy activity amongst any of the 120,000 people who were incarcerated. But if you're ever in Santa Ana and you want to come by and see this, I think it's a kind of a unique memorial, even though they don't call it a memorial. And it's quite a beautiful and peaceful place in the midst of our county justice civic center. Next place. Kindness is respecting our differences and celebrating shared history moving forward as one humanity. And this is a picture of Sylvia Mendez. She's now 87 this year, I think, and myself. And funny enough, we were VIP guests at Westminster School District's 150th anniversary. And so it kind of tells the whole tale that the school district that prohibited her from going to that Westminster 17th Street School has now one of a very, very diverse student population. And also that they now hold this story and really treasure Sylvia's involvement at their 150th anniversary. But I think you could see it was a very joyous occasion, and we want to hold this history and share it because it did take the kindness of many people who supported either in kind or in action, or just as dear friends to help our families through this, these trials and the adversity of war, and also war of racism. I've added my website. I have different educational materials, free handouts and stuff, if you would like to learn more, and also on social media. I love posting stories of these kindness stories that really change people's lives. And I think I always say, if this story could happen in the midst of World War II, then there's so much more that we can be inspired and involved in to participate, to really be the people and respect each other and celebrate our diversity as we move forward. Okay,
Janice,
It looks like
thank you.
we have questions. We have
Yes.
probably have some questions, so I'm going to
Okay.
stop sharing right now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Janice? I'll
Yes.
start with a few questions in the same order as your presentation.
Okay.
Okay. This is a message from Linda KG. Her question: was your family able to accept any payments from the lease while they were incarcerated in the camps?
Yes. I go into more detail of this in the book, but Sylvia remembers, and she was only a young kid, and Gonzalo died fairly young. He was only 51 when he died, so I never met him. But she remembers driving with her father across the California desert to Poston because her father had to take money. And I think that's just another indication of Gonzalo's integrity and how much he wanted to collaborate with our family, because he wasn't sure that my dad would get the money for the lease. And in the camps, they did need to fund. I mean, if they wanted to sew a new dress, they could only take 2 suitcases. So if they wanted to sew a new dress, or if they wanted, there was no heat, if they needed an extra blanket, they had to buy these things. They weren't given everything by the government by any means. And so they did need to have funds or to send letters, postage to send letters to my grandfather, or I know one of my aunts always said how my dad, who was 13 years older than she, would get candy, and she would always say, I remember, Tad getting candy for us as kids, or for books for school or any of those things. So, but that was one of the things my dad probably, they probably could have deposited it at the bank because Mr. Monroe was there, but there was no bank in Poston for my dad to withdraw it. So that is one of the stories that Sylvia shared with me.
Okay, thank you. Second question is from a mutual friend, Christine Kawai. The Minomitsu story and the way you tell it is so effective at capturing the true impact of the World War II concentration camps on Japanese American families. Since you've published the book, what feedback have you gotten from other Japanese Americans who experienced this as well?
Hi, Christine. Thanks for the question. Interesting. Some of them go, oh my gosh, I could so relate to this. So much of their story is very parallel to our story. Some of them, and in fact, I have been sharing this with teachers, mostly educators, who through the Museum of Tolerance, their Tools for Tolerance program in LA, I've spoken there probably almost 16 times in the last half year. One of the teachers has shared this story with her Japanese American colleague who knew nothing about the camps because their family never spoke about it. And from an Asian culture, there's a lot of shame with this, even though they were innocent. Just being accused, their integrity, being accused of the fact that they could be spies or related to the enemy when they had never been to Japan. This carries a lot of shame with it. And so there are many families, Japanese American families, who never spoke about this. Their kids know something happened, but their parents would never speak about it. And I've gotten more different comments from either third generation or fourth generation Japanese Americans who said, thank you for writing this, because now I can understand my family better. Many of their grandparents and parents have already passed, and so that history, their personal history, is lost. But they, in my book, I talk more about some of the emotional and psychological trauma. And I think that's where they're like, wow, now I can see why my parents acted this way or didn't share. Our family was pretty open about it. Not in a way that I never came across like a negative thing. And I think my dad and my grandfather definitely chose gratitude because Mr. Mendez was honest and he did know he leased the land. There are people, I've heard many of these stories where people leased their home or their land, and when they came back from the war, they did not get it back, and the law was not on their side, and they lost everything. And so I always say there was 120,000 Japanese Americans involved in this, and you will hear 120,000 different stories because everyone's situation was different. I think people who were my aunt's age, they are somewhat, depending on who you talk to, but my aunts are not as traumatized as you might think. Although I have talked to some people where this trauma has really affected kind of their sense of being and their identity. So please don't think that our Japanese American story is like everyone else's, but if you have Japanese American family members or friends, I would just ask, like, what was it like for your family? Because you will get a whole variety of different answers to that.
And here's a related actually question statement from Donna Holmes, who indicates, who says, are you familiar with Kyo's story by Kyo Sato, born in 1923? She is a Sacramento native with a very different experience. Her family also went to Poston.
A lot of people in the Sacramento area, Central Valley area also were in Poston. And that's why I say you have to really ask, this story is our story and it's related to Mendez versus Westminster because of our farm lease. But and I don't know, I'm not familiar with that particular story, but there are families, like I said, some areas voted that the Japanese could not come back. There are families who leased homes and lands and businesses and never got them back. And I think that is one of the reasons for, in Orange County, that kind of crazy plaque that says, thank you, but it doesn't
Right.
really say, it says thank you for the blessings of freedom. It doesn't really say what happened.
Exactly.
The mystery
Exactly
of
right.
that is really and quite honestly, there are Japanese Americans in the county, and I talk about this and they're like, what are you talking about? We don't even know that exists. I'm like, yes. I don't know what age I was. It's probably about 12 or 13 when it opened, and I'm like, I stuffed envelopes for this, and so I know about it, but the history of that is kind of obscure. But thank you for, sharing your local stories, because, and if you go to Washington, in Oregon, you will hear different stories because it's very local. But one of my grandfathers had been in Orange County for 39 years, and this grandfather had been here for 26 years. So depending on their relationships in the community and how the community reacted to the war, it could be a very, very different story.
Okay. And one final question that's somewhat related. It's from Patrice Lynn. She says, thank you for sharing these facts and your family's story. How great it was that people of different colors and religion came together to support people's rights. My question is, if your family expressed their feelings about what was going on then or now? I think you sort of answered it in the way that they.
Yeah,
said
I would say, I mean, I think we all know that you have to choose, to see the world one way or the other. And so I know one of the things I keep thinking about is, farmers, and also Mr. Mendez, restaurant business, you work 24 hours. It's your responsibility. You work in 7 days a week. And I think a lot of my father's frustration and anger probably got worked out on the farm just through hard work and things like that. But my parents, I would say they talked about it when I was a child, more practically describing what it was. I don't know how much emotion they actually gave. I mean, they said it was hard, this was hot, it was difficult. But it never gave me the sense that I should be scared. But I do realize now how different ways that my parents raised me to be resilient. And some of my other Japanese American farming friends, we would say that, we were called names, we would make fun of, luckily it was not physical attacks on us, but they were verbal attacks. And, but I think our parents, knowing what happened to them, kind of raised us to be resilient towards that.
Very
Yeah.
And it was personality driven too from your parents as well. Somewhat personality driven.
Yeah. I mean, if any of you knew my grandfather, he is as far from being a spy as you can imagine. But, being unjustly accused. And this was a lot of, I want to say there were probably a couple thousand men that were picked up by the Department of Justice, FBI. I don't have an exact number on that, but yeah. And if you're interested in this story, I've been posting different blogs of things that people have shared with me and stuff like that. So please go to my website and check out for more stories. And also I'd love to hear yours too. You can also send me an email there and tell me stories you know of, or that have happened to friends of yours or family members as well.
We have a final question, and it's a comment first from Suzanne Safakish. Her comment is, even the discriminatory laws in California was unequal. Question, why the law discriminated against Latinos, Native American, and Chinese, but not Japanese?
Oh, sorry. It was by school district. So the California state law said Native Americans, Chinese, and Japanese. It actually didn't list Mexican in the state law. But that is why Attorney Marcus decided to go to federal court, because he was concerned that if he took this to court in state court, they would just add Mexicans to the list. And oftentimes people say, how come that list did not include Black Americans? But at this time in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, the population of Black Americans was not very large. It was more after World War II when many of the servicemen came back either to the Bay Area or to San Diego, where the Black population was higher. So in the state law, it was Native Americans, Chinese, and Japanese. And two, Japanese and Chinese were predominantly, even when I grew up, it was, if you saw an Asian, they were Japanese or Chinese.
Right.
It was more recently after the 1960s where we got more diversity of Asian cultures here.
Okay, and Janice, that was the last question, but when we spoke about this at practice, Janice says there's always a question that always comes up, and it has not been asked. So I shall ask the question. What happened to the farm?
What happened to the farm? In the 1950s, through the city's eminent domain and that law, the farm was taken, and my dad had to move. They've moved to a farm in Garden Grove, but it was taken, and it's actually two schools. Very interesting. It's Finley Elementary and Johnson Middle School of the Westminster School District. So it's quite an interesting full circle that this land that really brought forth the inequity for the children would now be two schools. The other thing I'll mention is just in December, the City of Westminster dedicated the Mendez Tribute Monument. It's a very small park. It's much more of a historical and educational exhibit than it is, a playground park. But they just dedicated that in Westminster. And if you're in Westminster, I'd love for you to go visit it, because it has educational panels that were done by the Department of Education here in Orange County, talking about this story and much of the case of Mendez versus Westminster. And it's brand new, and it has augmented reality and QR codes for more info. And it was built for field trips for children. So just want you to know about that as a resource if you're ever in the area.
That's great. I'm going to hand this over to Sandy, who wants to say a few words of thank you to you, Janice. Sandy?
Well, thank you. Thank you to all of you. I really just feel so blessed to be able to share this story with you.
Janice, we wanted to say thank you, and I particularly wanted to say thank you for sharing your family's rich history with us. And I think based on the number of people who participated tonight and asked questions, you've touched a chord with our members who might have family or friends who have maybe similar, maybe different experiences from that same era. I love your references to kindness throughout the book. I love you are using that as a theme to share your thoughts. And it seems to me that your book is also a testament to the fact that one person can make a difference. And thank you for sharing your story with us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for the honor of speaking to your members.
Yes. For those of you who are getting ready to leave, Julika is going to share one little slide with you. We'd like your feedback. Did this work for you? And so we have a short survey at the end, and when you leave Zoom, you're going to see a screen like this, and there's going to be a blue button that says continue. If you click on that, you'll go to a very, very short survey. We just want to know how it worked. Is there anything that we can do better so that we can continue to improve our webinars? And with that, I'm going to say good evening. Thank you to Janice and Julika, who are working in the background to make sure that this went smoothly. So good night, everybody.